I think this is going to be a great discussion today. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to start us off, I think, now. I'm not sure if Eric's on yet or not, but he'll be joining.
Okay.
Um, so, all right. So thanks for all for joining us today. Today we're talking about the ethics of COVID-19 vaccine incentives and mandates. And we have some special guests with us today. So I'm going to go through those three special guests. Um, the first is Craig Klugman, who's a Vincent DePaul Professor of Bioethics and Health Humanities at DePaul. He teaches and conducts research in bioethics, public health ethics, and health humanities. His current projects examine pandemics, end of life, digital health, and ethics and humanities education. He's the editor of Research Ethics and Health Humanities, Medical Ethics, and Ethical Issues in Rural Health. Dr. Klugman's a member of the Northwestern Memorial Hospital Ethics Committee and a voting member of the National Biosecurity Science Board. He's co-director of the Bioethics and Society Minor, co-faculty facilitator of the DePaul Op-Ed Project's Public Voices Fellowship, and served on the DePaul COVID Response and Reopening Task Forces, and formerly chair of the Health Sciences. Klugman is the co-chair of Health Humanities Consortium, an international assembly of scholars, educators, and artists. He's a graduate of Stanford for undergrad human biology, Case Western Reserve for master's in bioethics and medical anthropology, and the University of Texas Medical Branch for PhD in medical humanities. Next is Eric Swirsky, who is a lawyer and clinical associate professor of biomedicine and health sciences at UIC. He also serves as the director of graduate studies at UIC. Professor Swirsky also serves on the faculty of the Rehabilitation Sciences program and the UIC Honors College. Using his unique blend of experience and knowledge, Dr. Swirsky teaches courses in communication skills, professionalism and ethics, and legal issues in health sciences. He also lectures on topics related to intellectual property, negotiations, the impact of social media upon healthcare, end-of-life decision-making, and other ethical and legal aspects of healthcare. His scholarly interests revolve around ethical conundra attendant to human interaction with computers and data. His areas of expertise reside in areas related to ethical use of information, medical technology, clinical intervention, and the socio-technological milieu in which they converge. And then finally, we have Lori Zoloth, PhD, who is a Margaret E. Burton Professor of Religion and Ethics at the University of Chicago. A leader in the field of religious studies with particular scholarly interests in bioethics and Jewish studies, Lori Zoloth's research explores religion and ethics, drawing from sources ranging from biblical to Talmudic texts, postmodern Jewish philosophy, including writings of Emmanuel Levinas. Her scholarship spans the ethics of genetic engineering, stem cell research, synthetic biology, social justice and healthcare, and how science and medicine are taught. She's the author of numerous books. Zoloth has been president of the American Academy of Religion and American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. She was the inaugural director of the Jewish Studies program at San Francisco State University and director of graduate studies in religious studies at Northwestern. She's an elected member of the Hastings Center and a life member of Clare Hall, University of Cambridge. She's a founding board member of the Society for Scriptural Reasoning. Her work on bioethics and healthcare led for her to serve on NASA's Advisory Council, the space agency's highest civilian board, the International Planetary Protection Committee, the National Recombinant DNA Advisory Board, the Executive Committee of the International Society for Stem Cell Research. She served as the chair of the first Bioethics Advisory Board at the Howard Hughes Medical Research Institute and has testified in front of Congress, the President's Commission on Bioethics, and state legislatures. She began her career as a neonatal work, working in impoverished communities, holds a bachelor's degree in women's studies from the University of California, Berkeley, bachelor's degree in nursing from the University of the State of New York. She received a master's degree in Jewish studies and doctorate in social ethics from the Graduate Theological Union, also holds a master's degree in English from San Francisco State University. So thank you all for joining us. So this session today, it is an open discussion. So we have our three special guests who are here to provide their viewpoints, but ideally we want this to be open to all. So if you want to share your opinion when we get to the discussion questions, please do. If you're more comfortable putting them in the chat, that's totally fine. Or if you want to private message them to me and then I will share them anonymously, that's fine as well. The goal of this is for it to be an open discussion. So ideally we have multiple viewpoints shared. So, you might hear things that you don't agree with, but the goal of this is for us to hear things that we don't agree with to make the discussion more robust. So to start us off with, we are going to talk first about COVID-19 vaccine mandates. So just a little bit of background before we get into our questions. So the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the laws do not prevent an employer from requiring all employees physically entering the workplace to be vaccinated for COVID-19, as long as employers comply with the reasonable accommodation provisions of the ADA and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other EEO considerations. It also states that employers administering vaccines may offer incentives to their employees vaccinate their employees if these incentives are not coercive. So that's kind of some background knowledge. Hospitals with COVID-19 vaccine mandates. I just got an email from Chicago Tribune like right before this started because we have even more hospitals joining this mandate now. So the very first hospital, many of you may know, was March 31st. Houston Methodist was the first to administer the hospital mandate. As of yesterday, there were over 125 hospitals throughout the US with those mandates. So you can see the Chicago area hospitals, July 8th, Loyola publicized their mandate. July 13th, University of Chicago. July 26th, Rush. Advocate was August 4th. And then as of today is Lurie Children's. You can see this link down here, Becker's Hospital Review. They are updating the link, like I think basically every day with new hospitals that are joining. And what the mandates actually entail are different. Some of it's a true mandate. You must have it or you cannot work. Others like Mayo Clinic mentioned that you need to have there's a mandate, but if you don't get the vaccine, you just need to wear a mask and socially distance. So they are a little bit different what the mandates entail. So now to our questions. So the very first question, should institutions or the government in the US be able to mandate COVID-19 vaccination for employees, including healthcare workers or like general employees in other professions as well?
Do you want us to answer?
Yes. Yep. Open floor.
Yes.
Yes, as well. I think we have to look at the difference between private institutions and public institutions because our laws make those discriminations. And private institutions have always had the ability and the right to make mandates for whatever they want. Flu vaccines, that you've had an MMR test, you've had your MMR, that you've had a tuberculosis test, like they can do anything. So the challenge in creating mandates has been in public institutions. And look, we are in a public health crisis right now, and the need to take care of each other overrides the need of individual choice because your individual choice may harm others. And we learned from John Stuart Mill that you can limit people's liberty when that poses a direct harm to others. And specifically, he meant taking away somebody else's liberty, and certainly the potential for spreading a deadly virus that has hospitalized huge numbers of people and killed many people. We're at like 620,000 in the United States alone, qualifies for a potential harm. So that is the long answer to yes.
There's even more about this because we even mandate for many things that don't harm others. They're just, we think, are bad ideas because the state has a duty to protect its citizens from death and from danger. That's why we put up suicide barriers on public bridges. That's why we say there's seatbelt laws, right? Even when you're all alone in the car, you have to wear a seatbelt. So there's lots of mandates. Our lives are extraordinarily structured already by the state, and we like that. That's what's called, we call that civilization. So I have to get a rabies shot for my dog before my dog can go into a public park. It would be tragic if that wasn't the case for for a COVID vaccine for my child, right? So it's this new concern about state mandate has nothing to do with much far older values about neighborliness and protecting one another and creating a just society.
I agree. There was an article in the Tribune over the weekend about one of the suburbs updating its code for dress. That they had this law that you had to dress appropriately to your gender, and so they have stricken that from their books. But you still have to wear clothes, right? You can't wear. There's really nowhere you can go where you can't wear clothes, which is a really simple thing, as Lori talked about. We do this all the time. You have to pay taxes. That's not an optional thing. You have to, if you drive a car, you have to have car insurance. Like we live in a world of mandates. This should be no different. In fact, the case is probably clearer for protecting the community and others in this mandate than for some of the others.
And yet there can be differences in mandate in the effects that they have on the person, because wearing a seatbelt is different than injecting something into somebody. And certainly we need to take a look at the different types of expectations if we're going to go through these authoritarian methods, because there's a cost to them. And one of the costs is the impact that it has on trust, which is part of the issue, I believe, that is related to why we find ourselves in the place that we are, that we've come to this place. We have battle of experts and authority, and it's difficult for many in the public to determine what is truth, what is not, and there is not great communication that has preceded this need for these types of measures.
Actually, we don't have a battle of experts, Professor Zworyski. We don't have a battle of experts. We have experts unanimous across the board, not only in healthcare, not only in research science, not only in clinical medicine, but in religion. Every expert has said the exact same thing. And then we have some people who have no expertise attacking them randomly with childish objections, with mistakes, with not understanding things, and for profit, for their own personal gain. So it's not, oh, there's two sides to the story. How can I possibly decide? There's one side to the story. And then there's some people who are putting forward flat earth kind of theories. We don't debate gravity. We don't debate many things about our lives that in fact do impinge on our lives. I don't have polio, and my auntie did. My aunt had polio because there wasn't a vaccine. And I don't, because we mandated vaccines for all school children in California. None of us have smallpox, right? And that the reason is we decided as a human species to eliminate smallpox, and everyone complied against their will, held down in some cases. And the Supreme Court decided that was really okay in 1905. So all of these things have been adjudicated for centuries, actually, within religious traditions, and for dozens of years within current civil law. And in fact, the only thing that's new is a new political wind about in the land. And that's the only thing that's different. Not expertise, not expert opinion, not people's ideas about personal space, a different politics. So let's just be clear about that. And it's okay if you have that political opinion, then you have to defend it as a political opinion, but not as a category of expertise.
I don't think it's okay when it's characterized as childishness or people get derided right out of the gate. But I believe that this inability to communicate is on both sides.
You know what? I don't think that, I just really disagree with that. I think we've been kind and explanatory and have everyone communicating and best healthcare communicators. Everyone understands it. People can understand complicated plots for soap operas. People understand that this vaccine, what the vaccine does and what this disease does. And now I think it's time for mandates. It's long past the time of explanation. We're long past the time of cajoling or nudging or bribing. Now it's time for mandates.
I represent an attorney. I met with him the other day. Very smart young black man. Now I got the vaccine, but we were talking about the vaccine. He was reluctant to get it, and he pointed out that Hank Aaron died 4 days after taking it. I don't know that. I think there are legitimate questions out there, and people should have. What happened to autonomy? People should have a right to make a decision for themselves. I think.
There are limits to your autonomy.
When the polio,
there are limits to your ability to make a decision. You can't decide to kill someone because you want their house, or kill someone because you want to date their spouse, right? So we have a society. You can't run into a theater and yell fire and get a panic going, right? We've always had limits to our rights.
And I agree with that. I agree with that. But when the
and there's not a question here. So not tested enough. Do you know there's over 2 billion people that have received on this planet that have received?
But the point is, there are people out there suggesting that there's concern about. For example,
less than 1,000.
What about natural? What about
Dr. Beaumont, the fact that there's
Mr.
people.
Klugman, I think we need to let Mr. Beaumont finish before he's interrupted.
Okay.
When the polio vaccine first came out, I think there were 100 kids that were paralyzed because there was a problem with it, and they were mandated to take it. There can be, I think there can be issues. There are people out there suggesting that there are problems with it, whether they're true or not. I'm not a doctor, but I'm leery to demand people, and it's still an experimental drug under the rules, but I understand that's beside the point. I think should go a long way before you start telling people what drugs they have to put in their body. The Supreme Court in Jacobson, which is the case that everybody cites, supports this, made it clear that if the individual has problems with vaccines, that they can bring it up, and the courts are able to keep those people from being punished for not taking the vaccine. That was clear. In other words, there are exceptions, according to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court recognized that there has to be exceptions. And when I talked to my client the other day, and he said, "Well, Hank Aaron died 4 days after taking the vaccine." How do you respond to that? There are a lot of maybe anecdotal, I don't know, but there's a lot of information out there, and there are other what appears to be, at least on the surface, qualified physicians talking about issues. A big issue seems to be the natural immunity issue. Why do people who have natural immunity, who have gotten this disease, have to take the vaccine? And maybe it's even harmful for those people. Now, I took the vaccine. I had COVID, and then I took the vaccine. But the point is, I would hate to let the government, I mean, maybe just because I'm a defense lawyer, and it's a natural response on my part, I don't know. But I hate to have the government be able to make certain decisions for me.
The government makes lots of decisions for you, and we like it to make the government to make decisions because you know why? You're not a lawyer. You are a lawyer. You're not a doctor.
Correct. I'm not.
Right? And so therefore you want the country, the brilliant country that we have, to put forward its smartest doctors and have that be called medical expertise, scientific expertise, and they do the tests and they run the lab tests, not every individual guy who thinks he's smarter than them. You're not. I'm sorry, you're not. You're not a doctor, you're not trained. And in fact, the tests have been done. Billions of people have gotten these vaccines. And occasionally when an elderly person lives their life and they will die of many things, right? We don't know Hank Aaron's underlying condition. We don't know if he had a cardiac, we don't know what his situation was. He could have died anyway. He could have died 4 days before. It's nothing, it is not the cause of his death. And
right, there's a difference between correlation and causation. There's a certain number of people who are going to die of a heart attack tomorrow. If they get their shot today, that doesn't mean they're still going to die of a heart attack tomorrow. There's no cause and effect.
That's fair.
We saw this with the autism complaints. It's just coincidence that these things happen at the same time. Now, this question of natural immunity, there is no such thing as natural immunity to a novel disease. Doesn't happen. Now, we know Sweden took that experiment that they weren't going to inoculate anybody. They weren't going to physically distance. They were going to have business as usual. And this is a society that is, socialist by their own declaration and supports their people and has a very low rate of poverty. And it was a miserable failure, caused a lot of sickness and a lot of death that was unavoidable. If we took this approach in the United States, and there were some so-called experts, Scott Atlas being one of them, Paul Rand being the other, people, again, talking outside their area of expertise, who advocated the United States going in this position. We know that the death rate is around 2% with Alpha. Delta, we don't know yet because it's still really new. And that would have meant about 6 million people in the United States dying from this disease, if you do the calculation out now. All right, because we have also been so delayed in getting people vaccinated, we are now, when we started this, when we had Alpha, we needed 70% of the population to be vaccinated, according to R-naught, which was 1 to 2, to be able to defeat this disease. Well, now that we have Delta and we have a very unvaccinated population, the R-naught is 6 to 9 people, which means for every infected person, they're infecting 6 to 9 people. This means we need to have 85% of people vaccinated in order to get herd immunity. That would be 6 million dead people if we didn't have a vaccine.
All vaccines have issues, whether there are no perfect vaccines. So what is the downside? How many, if we have everybody vaccinated to the point to get herd immunity, how many people will indeed suffer from some type of reaction to that vaccine? Can you tell me that? And what?
There's
and by the way, what
between by reaction, do you mean they got a sore arm, they didn't feel well for a couple of days, or that they died?
There's people that are paralyzed and die. What did
Not
Hank
from
Aaron
this
die from?
vaccine.
It's actually not from the vaccine. There's
Not from these
What did
vaccines.
Hank Aaron die from then? I'm curious.
Life, the things they would have died from things anyway, but it was not caused by the vaccine. There was
There's a
one
complaint
death
line.
that was believed to be connected to the vaccine, and they didn't have definitive proof that it was. Look, lack of proof is not proof. Saying something does not make it true. Just because it's on Fox News or you read it on the internet or it's on YouTube or you want to believe it's true does not make it true.
Oh, that's no question about that. But there's a hotline for vaccine injuries, and there's a lot of complaints.
course,
More
yes, and let me-
complaints than normal. What does that
Let me
mean?
add in some data to this discussion. So anaphylaxis after COVID-19 vaccine, per the CDC, occurs in 2 to 5 people per million. And that's like the main, that could cause death. But 2 to 5 people per million, and then how many more do we need to vaccinate? That's kind of one of the numbers there. There's also the concern for like thrombosis with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, myocarditis. Those risks are also like very low. But the main one, the one that could cause death, that's the numbers for you.
Well, that's the anaphylaxis without any treatment. It
Yeah.
doesn't cause death if you're waiting 15 minutes, which is why they make you wait 15 minutes so that you can have that reverse, right? So it doesn't absolutely cause death. So
And the number is, so per the CDC, it's 6,490 people out of 346 million doses. So that is a death rate of 0.0019% in the US.
So do you think those people who have that susceptibility should be able to opt out of it, or do you say nobody should opt out of it? And can those people balance what they perceive as a risk and compared to the benefits of taking the vaccine? And could they balance it and make a decision contrary to the decision you want them to make? Can they do that? Are they allowed to do that in your estimate?
Yeah, and I think, and I'm glad, thank you all for writing in the comment section. That's great. And please read this as we go. I think that's such a great point, and I'm glad we're having the diversity of opinion here too, which is great. Because I think maybe to that point, talking specifically for healthcare workers, are they held to a different standard than the general population being around patients? So maybe that could be our next point, is like discussing specifically for healthcare workers, should they be held to a different standard with this mandate than other people?
And why are many healthcare workers not taking the vaccine? It seems to be there's a large number. And what about the Cleveland Clinic paper that they worked on that suggests there is natural immunity? I mean, I tell you, I had some concern. I had COVID, and I, like I said, I took the vaccine, but I had concern. Was that going to harm me? I don't know. And there are people out there, whether you say they're quacks or not, I don't know them, but they say that taking the vaccine if you had COVID is going to be harmful.
Mr. Beaumont, let me just ask you a question. If I pretend to act like a lawyer, but I have no legal training, don't you think that'd be a silly thing to do? Go into court, no legal training, but just I'm a smart person?
Well, Lincoln said if you represent yourself in court, a person who represents himself in court has a fool for a client.
So there you are.
So I agree with that.
you
No,
agree
but as a lawyer,
There's such a thing as expertise, right?
but
Because
as
you're
a
a lawyer.
as a
You're
lawyer,
a lawyer, and you know more about the law than I do, right?
But
And so why don't I think what we're saying here is that this is a well-tested intervention that has stopped in large part a catastrophic death rate from COVID that had begun to wreak havoc in Americans. So there was 3,000 or 4,000 people dying every day in January. The vaccine came in and the death rate stops. The death rate drops precipitously. The only thing that changed was the vaccine. The weather hadn't changed yet. Behavior patterns hadn't changed yet. The mask wearing was the same throughout the thing that changed was the vaccine, which caused the death rate to drop precipitously. And it only began ticking up this summer when unvaccinated people were exposed to yet another novel virus, which is the Delta virus. It's novel. It's different enough that and it's 1,000 times more contagious, and people began to die. And the only thing that's going to stop that is mass vaccine mandates. And that's as simple as I can make it. And that's just how it works in infectious disease dynamics. The dynamics of the disease means you need to be vaccinated against it, like polio, like smallpox, like measles, like chickenpox, all the diseases that rip through a community. taking out the naive, right? People who are immunologically naive, the same thing is going to happen. And with every new variant, until people are vaccinated, until there's a high vaccination rate. And for measles, it has to be 95%. The human beings have figured something out. It's a good thing we figured it out. And now we just have to use it. We don't have to reinvent it. We have to test this version and we have to use it. We know this works because we don't have polio. We don't have smallpox. And so we know this works. We know that this is for human beings not to die of mass plagues.
I understand that, and I have no question the vaccine certainly has efficacy. But my concern is not taking an individual out of the equation and letting that person make a decision for him or herself to weigh whatever option he thinks he has.
You know why the individual is taken out of the equation? And it's really difficult for people who like their individuality and their autonomy. This disease took the individual out of the equation because this disease doesn't care who I am. It doesn't care who I love. It doesn't care about my children. It doesn't care about me. I'm just like one more iron on the fire, one more forest to burn through. My family. It doesn't care. I don't have any individuality. If I get sick and I infect 9 other people, random people, it doesn't matter. There's no individual here. You're not making an individual decision unless you don't want to get a vaccine and then you want to go to your room and stay in your room and not be around anyone else. That's the only way you can make an individual decision. But as soon as you're out in the world and you share my breath and I share your breath, we're no longer individuals in terms of the vaccine.
What do you do?
It's not an individual decision.
What do you do about the people that actually do have problems with it? What do you do with them? You say you lock them up?
We try to get everybody vaccinated that possibly can to protect exactly those people. So if you have cancer and you're on immunosuppressive therapy, if you have just gotten an organ transplant, if you have HIV/AIDS, if you have any number of diseases that affect the immune system, we need to protect those people. We need to protect our children. We need to protect our babies. There's no other way to protect them. Exactly right. The only way to protect these vulnerable people who tragically can't be vaccinated is for all of us to get vaccinated without drama, without upset, without claiming that our freedom is impaired. What we should be doing now is what Americans do really well, which is love our neighbor and care for our neighbor. It's very much a part of our society, and we need to act on that impulse. And if we can't act on that impulse, we should then impose mandates. This is even more true for healthcare workers because these vulnerable people who come into hospitals need our attention even more. By the way, it's the same thing. I feel the exact same way about flu.
I'm going to move us on to another question. Thank you all for the comments. And also, I just wanted to mention, I know some of the comments, everyone's very passionate about this topic. I think we're all still doing this in good faith. I know it's maybe coming out as a little bit aggressive, like per the chats to me, but I just want you to know, like, this is kind of, we mean it in good, discussion here. So we all are trying to be kind to one another. It just might be coming out as very passionate because we are.
And if I'm not being kind, I apologize. I'm unfortunately. Unfortunately, I'm an attorney, and that's what I do all day long. So it's a natural instinct. So I don't mean to be unkind to anybody, for sure.
No. Thank you so much. Okay, so the next question I wanted to discuss is, should mandates differ whether employees are patient facing or not, or public facing or not? So you might have noticed, like Walmart, they're requiring their corporate workers to be vaccinated, but not their front line. They're providing incentives for their front line to be vaccinated, but not mandating it. Like, is that right that like corporations should be mandating it for their maybe like higher educated workforce rather than the front line who are actually going to be impacting more of the public?
I'm someone who thinks everybody should be vaccinated, no matter what they're doing. But I really think that the mandate should apply to Americans and citizens. We don't have to have it, so it shouldn't be piecemeal. It should be across the board. I mean, if we're serious about ending this disease and getting back to a semblance of normal, we have to take it seriously. That's all there is to it. It shouldn't matter what you do. It should anyone can spread it in any way.
All right, next question. Should institutions or like other organizations, like either healthcare or not, should they do they have the obligation to find alternative work for people who aren't able to be vaccinated or not willing to be vaccinated?
So it probably depends on the situation. I mean, when we look at the Houston Methodist Hospital, if you didn't get the vaccine and there were no accommodations, you were out. So are you not getting the vaccine because you have a medical reason that may require your employer to make accommodations? It may be an ADA issue, but if it's because of religious or personal belief, then there is no obligation to do that because you're not imposing a threat to another. We got to remember, this is not about individual choice. This is about protecting a community. And if we need 85 to 90% of people to be vaccinated, we have to be very stingy about the exceptions that we accept.
So I guess I have a question then. Who makes the decisions on what exceptions we accept and what exceptions we don't?
Well, so that's a good question. When you're dealing with a company like Walmart, they're a private corporation. They get to make that decision for them. As long as, legally, and Mr. Beaumont can probably speak better to this and Mr. Swirsky than I can, there are protected classes. Not being unvaccinated is not a protected class, right? It's not a religion, it's not an age, it's not a gender issue, it's a choice. And so if you're again, this is that private public thing. So if you're a private company, you get to do what you want. You can choose who goes into your shop and you can go what you're requiring of your people, your staff, as long as it doesn't violate a protected class or discriminate against a protected class. But if we're dealing with a public entity, the rules are generally different because you generally have more rights if you're working for a public institution or a public entity. So does there need to be more accommodation there? I don't know. So, at my university, we're requiring all students, faculty, and staff to be vaccinated. We also have an indoor mask mandate, so everybody needs to be masked. Now, if you are a frontline worker who is dealing with students at a desk, say, or you're taking entry of patients in the clinic, or you are the cashier in a store, can you be accommodated to do that job if you're not vaccinated? Because the threat is, you can take on a threat yourself that I'm going to get the disease, but where we're drawing the line here is that you shouldn't be able to threaten the health of somebody else by causing them harm. Can you do that job without threatening the health of someone else? And I think that's the question that needs to be answered there.
I mean, the question of how you judge the people's refusals, I think it's reasonable to expect people to put their reason for refusal in writing. That it has to be rational, not irrational. And that if it's a medical condition, they need a physician to the employer has to there has to be a medical accommodation, but that has to be verified and certified, not just one random doctor, but it has to really be a real medical condition with proof. I just want to say this briefly. There's no religion that is saying you shouldn't take a vaccine, except for the Nation of Islam, which in fact is opposing vaccinations. But no other religion in the United States, including Christian Scientists, who often refuse medical intervention, is saying you shouldn't take a vaccine. The leaders of these religions have made it clear. In fact, they've made it clear since smallpox that vaccination is important, and keeping yourself healthy is one of God's commands in many religious traditions. In Islam, in Judaism, across the board, it's a requirement that you take care of yourself. And in fact, there is, to say religious reason, it really isn't in keeping with the leadership and the experts within your own tradition. I say this as a scholar of religious traditions who's watched their views on vaccination proceed over several generations. And so I think this is important to say this. People just throw that out as if that's a real thing, but it's not. Someone can claim that God tells them something. That happens all the time. But in this case, it's completely, it's an inauthentic claim. So. Just making that point in case anyone wants to use that reason.
All right. Mandates like these will likely affect certain groups more than others. There might be concern for potential racial and ethnic disparities in who's impacted by these mandates. Should, when we, like, these decisions are made about enacting these mandates, should that be taken into account that certain population groups might be disproportionately affected by the mandates than other groups?
Can you say more about that question?
Yeah, so like with these vaccine mandates, like we have data that people of color have lower vaccination rates than white. So if we're going to enact these mandates, it's going to affect potentially people of color more than it is people who are white. And is that we know that going into this, people of color have already been disproportionately impacted by COVID, and now they potentially might be more likely to lose their job because of some mandate. Is that okay that we are going into this knowing that certain populations are going to be more affected by the mandates and potentially more negatively affected by them job-wise than other populations?
But if you don't mandate, then they're more likely to die. And then you're ignoring the fact that the death rate in these populations is far higher. They're much more at risk. So all the risk factors that make them more likely to die, right, are going to be potentiated by you saying, by you not doing an intervention that could save their lives. That seems to me to be the racist intervention, actually, to ignore that fact. You're leaving them unprotected just at the moment that these populations need the mandate the most. It's not oppressive to tell someone, put on a seatbelt. It's not oppressive to tell someone, you have to have a polio vaccine. And the rates are the same in populations. The rate of these refusal for vaccination has to do with longstanding structural racism, longstanding systems of oppression. But doesn't mean that now, at this moment, in a medical crisis and an international pandemic, we turn away and say, well, we can't do anything because it might be unfair. It'd be unfair not to do something. This is precisely the moment that you have to correct those misapprehensions and move ahead to radically protect people. And if
I wonder if we can talk about, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Hi, I wonder if we can talk about, I mean, I understand the tenor of this conversation. I really do. I am a huge advocate for vaccines. I am a medical consumer. But here is my question. I need to understand, where is this, what is the most recent data that is coming out that came through in the past couple of weeks? Because isn't the idea that if somebody is vaccinated, they are protected? They are protected. So what is happening? Is there data coming out that's saying that the unvaccinated are a threat to the vaccinated? Is that what we're talking about? Or are we saying that this is a push to protect people who cannot be vaccinated? Because I think that those are two different things. And what I'm trying to understand is, as a healthcare provider, how do I convince somebody who says, wait a minute, why would I not be able to go to that party and not be vaccinated? Everybody who is interested in protecting themselves has taken the vaccine. What do you say to that?
So this is the public health approach, right, of herd immunity. This is our gold standard. We want herd immunity. Herd immunity means not everybody's vaccinated, but most people are vaccinated, because we're going to have members of our population who can't be vaccinated. Right now, they're under 12, they're immunocompromised, they're taking cancer treatment. And so we have to get most people vaccinated, 85 to 90%, to protect those who cannot take the vaccine or who don't get a reaction to the vaccine. So I know people who are on immunocompromised drugs that suppress their immune system, and they've taken 2 shots, they've taken 3 shots, and they still don't have an antibody. They still don't have T cells running around. So it's because this isn't about you. This isn't about an individual. This is about us and the community. And in medicine, we are so trained to think about individuals that it's hard to make the shift to thinking about, I'm treating a community. But that's where we are at in this right now. So yes, you are vaccinated. Your chance of getting this is very low. Not 0, but low, right? So why do we now have indoor mask mandates in New York, in Los Angeles, in big chunks of Chicago? Because there are breakthrough infections. And that means that vaccinated people are being exposed, often by their kids who are 6 or 7 years old, right? Because none of them are vaccinated. And so We know there's some breakthrough. We know that there's probably an increasing number of breakthroughs. And we're also trying to fight against the ultimate nightmare. And I know it seems hard to believe that there's a nightmare worse than this pandemic we've been in. And the ultimate nightmare is that there is a mutation that goes around the vaccine. And that's what we're trying to prevent. So the more people who get COVID, the more chances there are for the virus to mutate and evolve. And what it's evolving against is the fact that there are 50% of us who are vaccinated right now in the United States. Some countries, there's like 10 people in the whole country who are vaccinated. And if we allow the spread of this and it mutates, then we're back where we were last April.
Here's a way to think about it. And I
Yeah.
think it's a really, imagine that the virus was big and not microscopic. Okay. So now you have, and imagine they wore like stormtrooper uniforms, like in Star Wars, right? And imagine they had invaded our country. All these guys, it's gendered, so they're all going to be guys. Right? All these guys had invaded our country. And some people, like Mr. Bubon says, people should be free to live with the stormtroopers. And so some people have actually invited the stormtroopers into their house and collaborated with them and are hanging out with them, right? Doesn't seem to bother them, or maybe they just hit them over the head a few times and they get up, they're okay, they have a concussion, but they can still function, right? If you go to a party with someone who hangs out with stormtroopers and says, come to the party with me and my 50 stormtroopers crowding into the party, it is likely that some of them will hurt you, right? It just is. There's a lot of stormtroopers around, and you pretty much are wearing armor, pretty much, but every now and then there might be chinks in the armor. So what you want to do is, the thing about stormtroopers is they need a house to live in. You want to make sure that they don't come into your house, and you want to make sure that if they don't live in a house, after a few days they die. You want to make sure that they die. All of them die. That'd be the way to get rid of the stormtroopers who've invaded our country. Is don't give them a house. Just don't give them a house. Don't collaborate. Don't be a collaborator. It worked with, and that's how you have to think about vaccines and vaccine mandates. They're not perfect. There's chinks in the armor. And if you're in a room with somebody with 1,000 stormtroopers with them, right, then suddenly it's a little more dangerous. It makes you, it's worrisome. So that's why if you go outside and you're, as I was this weekend on the beach in Evanston, and there's like tons of people with all their tons of stormtroopers, maybe not, right? The likelihood is it's not so safe with all the stormtroopers. So what we want to do is get rid of the stormtroopers. And the only way you do that is by saying, not in my house. You can't come into my house. Everybody's wearing armor. You can't get in. And it makes it better. That's a simple way to understand it. Think of the vaccine as large, not microscopic. And you'll have a better sense of why you don't want to hang out with them, because they're very dangerous. They're not 100%, they won't necessarily kill you. Some of them hang around for a year afterward, making you sick. It's just as simple as that. You've got to get them out of the house so that they die, so they're not around anymore. If COVID doesn't have a body to infect, the virus can't spontaneously grow. So you want to make sure that everybody is protected so the virus will die and not be around as much. Will new people from countries without vaccines come into our country and spread it? Yes, that will happen. That will continue to happen until the world is vaccinated. And that's why people want to vaccinate the whole world before we do booster shots. That's the good reason why. But Craig's nightmare scenario has happened already with Delta. Delta's already nightmare one. Imagine one that's just a tiny bit, turn the knob just a little bit more virulent, right? Or a little bit more pathogenic, and we would be in our houses back to Zoom all the time again.
It exists. We have Lambda, which you've heard a little bit about. There's about 700 cases in the US. This was the formerly known as the Brazilian variant. Hit the town of Manaus, Brazil, a large city in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. 75% of people there had COVID. There was no vaccine to be found. Brazil's not done much in vaccination. And it turned out that almost 3/4 of those people who had alpha then caught Lambda. So we've barely begun to see that. So these mutations are out there, they're happening. The other thing, we keep talking about this in terms of hospitalizations and deaths. But there's another scenario out there, which we're seeing, which is the long haulers. And long COVID is what worries me about young people. So young people have a less likely chance of dying, although you probably are seeing in your ICUs now that the average age has dropped. It used to be in the 60s, now it's in the 40s. But we are seeing that there are people who are getting this disease who are now having long COVID. A lot of hospitals are opening long COVID clinics. We don't know. We do know 1/3 of people with COVID have changes to their brain. 1/3. We know that there are changes to the lung, liver, kidneys. What is this? Is this a short-term thing? Are these dangerous changes? We don't have this data yet. My father did have polio, was not a beneficiary of Dr. Salk's vaccine, and he is almost 80 now and has had, never was in an iron lung, has done okay, but has had serious health conditions for the last 65 years. What is this going to look like from COVID? I've heard some cardiologists predict that in 10 years, we're suddenly going to have a whole bunch of people needing heart transplants because of the cardiac damage from the virus. Think about things like chickenpox, right, which sit in your body for decades, and then suddenly you end up with shingles. So that immediate death comes for this disease, but that we start seeing some sort of an increase over the decades to come. So I think that's really important to think about. Booster vaccines. So it's an interesting, and I think this has a lot to do with pharmaceutical marketing. Pfizer has come out and said, yes, there will be boosters. There have to be boosters. The WHO has come out and said, don't think about boosters because, 2/3 of the world hasn't even seen hasn't seen their first injection yet, never mind doing boosters. So it's this question of how do we distribute, fairly allocate this? As Dr. Zola said, until we can vaccinate the whole world, there's always going to be a risk here. So the government is not going to put down a booster requirement. There is some, Dr. Fauci has come out and said he thinks for people who are older or immunocompromised, it may be a benefit, but the WHO is really pushing against that. Moderna hasn't said anything. Johnson & Johnson hasn't said anything. So I think, in fact, Moderna came out with a study last week that said they haven't seen a need for boosters yet. So the science, we don't have an answer because the science isn't there yet. We are continuing to collect data. Remember, the very first people to get any of these vaccines was a year ago, May, and they haven't needed boosters yet because that's when we started clinical trials.
One of the things that's important to remember, and that, and Dr. Klugen's statement is really important. People are upset about the changing healthcare information, but this is a very new disease, very, very new, right? It's only really December 2019, which is a blip of time away in human history, where anyone had this disease. This virus is brand new, and we don't know much about it. And we're going to change the information is going to change over and over and over again because we don't understand it. So I know that's frustrating, and it's frustrating to me too when the rules change. It's made me much more conservative about everything. It made me very wary about this disease. But I think we have to we have to be prepared for that, for significant changes, for worsening, for the mutations to worsen as well. I'm worried that people get tired of it, which is a little odd. Like, people didn't get tired of World War II. They fought on for years and years and years. And so I'm sort of curious about why people are tired of this. Because relative to having to be conscripted into the army and getting shot seems like a pretty minor inconvenience. It's hard for some people. But people have died in alarming numbers, and the way people are getting tired of the precautions always shocks me. Maybe it's hard to take it seriously. Maybe it's very, very hard to really face the gravity of our situation, the danger that we're in.
I'm going to move us on. Oh, go ahead. Do you want to?
No. Well, I was going to say, Dr. Zoloth makes a good point here that, World War II was the last time, really, maybe Vietnam to an extent, where the United States has asked a sacrifice of its population. We are just finishing 20-year-long wars in the Middle East, which whole separate topic. But nobody was asked to sacrifice for these wars, right? Our lives didn't change for the most part for most people. And yet we are asking, John F. Kennedy said, don't ask what you can do for your country, but don't ask what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And your country's asking some very simple things to protect each other. But it's been 80 years since we've really asked anything of our population as sacrifice.
Well, there was
And
pretty
so I think
effective
that's part of this
propaganda
message.
during that time, and that there was effective propaganda that helped to motivate and unify people, and that type of communication, right, trying to reach people where they are in ways that they can understand them, is what I was alluding to before. I'd agree that, Americans do some things best, and part of those things that we do really well are working together in this unified way, as Dr. Zoloff said earlier. But what I don't hear is, and what I don't see is the reaching out, that we may publicize things and we have experts and pundits that are saying things and information is changing, but there needs to be a more meaningful response for certain populations, right, who have been historically underserved or mistreated by the medical industrial complex and whichever. And so there needs to be more than a mandate, right? I don't believe that we've done enough in that way to educate people. And we have to do more than just appealing to experts and making the case for technocracy. That we have to have some way to have a democratic process and reach people in ways that are meaningful to them and address their needs and concerns. So we can have a just society and be safe.
Professor Tversky, I'm not advocating for technocracy. I grew up in Berkeley. Hey, I don't want technocracy. I don't want a biomedical state. I've read Foucault. I don't want any of that stuff, right? This is a worldwide pandemic, and we're asking people to get a shot so they don't spread the disease and die of it themselves. That's hardly the state coming into us and changing our lives. That's ridiculous. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be mean, but do you see what I'm saying? It's like it's a long way from authoritarianism. It's a long way. This is a crisis.
I think in the eyes of intellectuals, maybe it is, but in the eyes of the general public who don't have degrees and the means to understand the way that others do, I respectfully disagree. I'm sorry. Not everybody understands things the way that the educated do. And it is the responsibility of the educated.
Professor, all over the world, in every country of the world, what's unique about this moment in our lives is that everyone in the world has had to confront this and had to deal with this. The fierce vaccine backlash, this my liberty, give me liberty and give me death kind of sloganeering, is an American phenomena. Yeah, there's a few people that have taken it up in authoritarian countries. There's some bad leadership. Most people are begging for a vaccine. Most humans confronted with this are begging for a vaccine, are desperate for a vaccine, right? So the fact that it's not really underserved communities that are not vaccinated. You know who's not vaccinated? Republicans. That's who's not vaccinated. By and large, it's Republicans. And that's shocking to me because it means that all of the rhetoric around freedom, all of that has to do with just politics. And that's a tragedy. That's an American tragedy. And because it's going to begin to affect children this month, it just makes it all the more frustrating to be having these conversations. It's not a declaration of freedom not to get a shot so you don't die of a terrible disease and give it to your neighbor. It's just a shot, like polio. It's very similar. And I find this I find the whole drama around this sort of baffling. Wasn't a vaccine what everyone was begging for in the early part of the epidemic? Wasn't that the great magic bullet? So we have a magic bullet and nobody wants. People don't want it. Half the country doesn't want it. It's really shocking to me. I'm continually surprised by this. And I don't think it's that people don't understand. People understood the intricacies of the O.J. Simpson trial. People understand, the plot of Lost, which, I didn't get. So, people understand a lot of complicated things. They understand what's going on. All around the world, we understand what's going on. In many languages, in many countries, You know, in African villages, people have taught this. It's possible. It's not that people don't know that there's a vaccine. They don't know that there's a deadly epidemic. I don't think it's a communication problem at all. I think it's a real difference in values, a significant difference in values. And that's what makes it an interesting ethical problem. People are making a choice for a certain set of behaviors based on their values, which I think are bad choices and bad values.
All right, I'm going to move us on to one more section and then we'll be done for the day. Looking at patient autonomy from like the patient side now, not just personal autonomy, but from patients. Do patients have the right to ask for a healthcare worker and a healthcare team that has been vaccinated? And if, you know, potentially like myself as a physician, what if I'm immunocompromised and that COVID shot didn't work for me? Does a patient have a right to know my immunocompromised status and request someone else other than me to care for them?
You know, a lot of our decisions and the ways of thinking in ethics is about making analogies. So, you know, I think about, you know, we have one of the classic ethical scenarios is, does a patient have the right to say, I only want a doctor of a certain gender, or I only want a doctor of a certain race or ethnicity? And we should do it. If it's otherwise, we tend not to do it because, again, it seems more discriminatory. Another analogy I think about is in the beginnings of the epidemic of HIV. It's not anywhere close to being done. Doctors who were positive weren't no longer allowed to treat patients, and patients would ask, and did they have to answer? So this is not new. I think this is my way of saying this is not new territory. We have dealt with some challenges like this before. I even saw like an Ask Amy question about this. Can I ask my healthcare provider? And the answer is yes. Yes, you can. They don't have to answer. You can ask any question you want. The person does not have to answer. So that's one. You're not violating, there's no medical privacy issue here that, you know, a right to privacy your doctor has. If it could affect their ability to treat you, then you absolutely have a right to know. If you could potentially become infected by their choices, then you absolutely have a right to know. So I think there's nothing wrong with asking the question, and it's up to them whether they choose to answer.
I want to respond to something that someone said in the chat about this is an interesting phrase because it comes up a lot, right? The question starts out well, and I think Professor Krugman has answered it well. The CDC didn't know about the risk with Delta, didn't know that you would carry so much virus in your nose, even if you were vaccinated, that could happen. And that was perplexing. And maybe the CDC, desperate to get back, you know, on the data they had, thought that the lifting the masking recommendation, which by the way, they said it might have to go back in when they lifted it. Maybe that was premature, fair enough. But and it is confusing and it's difficult. We have to really be grown-ups here and understand what it is to be making recommendations in real time as a disease is progressing. I'm sure all of you who are healthcare professionals know about this. You know, when you're in front of a patient, the patient's disease dynamics changes rapidly. You change your care based on the changing dynamics. But the trouble with saying a phrase like, one should be able to think for themselves and truly scrutinize what pharmaceuticals they will have injected into their body, that's a very dangerous idea. And I see that idea put forward all the time. Sometimes people say things on Fox News like, do the research. And I'm thinking, do the research? How some random individual can't do the research? The research is really complicated. That's why we have peer review. That's why we have thousands of people looking at this. That's why we have entire labs at our universities working on these complicated problems. No random, I can't do the research by myself. You can't know that. So it's just a phrase that makes it seem like any person can somehow come independently to their own idea, and it's going to be better than the National Institutes of Health and the CDC. I just think that's a very dangerous set of ideas about knowledge itself, about how you know something is true, how we test out truth. Now, I know there's been a lot of confusion about truth in the last 4 years. It's an embattled concept, but it still exists. Some things are real. That's how science works. And saying that we're just going to figure out our own individual way through it, the thicket of claims, is, I think, an absurd proposition. So be careful when you tell people to do that. Do the research about what's injected. I don't know. Do you know what's in your in your stevia? Was that tested? Where's the data? I don't know. When someone says it's never been tested on animals, I really worry. Did they test this shampoo on children? Who did they test it on if they didn't test it on animals? So all these claims for naturalness and inherent knowledge of stuff, I just think it's absurd. And I think we have to really stop and act, sort of pull it together, folks, and let's be grown-ups. This is a very serious situation. We can't figure it out on our own. No one's alone in this. So, you know.
When I teach public health ethics to my students, I ask them, so how many of you this morning tested your water for lead levels and arsenic before you drank it? No? Anybody? Okay, did you check your air this morning for particulate matter before you took a breath? No? Did you pave your own road or your own train line to get to work this morning? Although many of us are probably still at home. And the answer is no. And that's because there are certain things we cannot do alone as individuals that we can only do in terms of groups. This is why we have civilization, right? Because there are things we do better and we can only do because we can't all be experts. And so we rely on public health to know more than we do. And that's really quite important. The idea of natural therapy and natural ideas being better than something, an mRNA and vaccine that's been on development for 30 years, been tested on 50, 60,000, each one was tested on 65,000 people when the majority of drugs we take have been tested on less than 1,000 people. Actually has a historical precedent. It goes back to the late 1800s with Kellogg of cereal fame, who developed a clinic in Michigan and put forth this idea that something in nature had to be better. Well, here's the thing. Most of our drugs come from nature. Aspirin's from nature, mRNA's from nature. We aren't necessarily creating things that didn't exist before. And so, the question is, why do we have this belief? E. coli's from nature. Do you want to down some of that? Like, we have this sense of nature as innocent, as pure, but that's just not the case. I mean, environmental, the EPA has lots of places where you don't want to drink the water or touch the soil. Here in Chicago, we have so much lead in our pipes, there are places where if your house is, until 1986, we required lead pipes. We can know where they've been changed, and don't let your children drink from those pipes without using the city's result. Sorry, I do get very passionate about this stuff. The city's answer to lead in the water was to give out Brita water filters. And we are now looking for federal money to be able to replace all of our water pipes, hopefully in the next 15, 20 years.
All right.
I think we're talking about granting government power, though, and I think that could be a problem because throughout history, governments with too much power cause a lot of mayhem, including our own government. So I think at least we should be leery and we should look closely as to what powers we do grant the government and what powers we don't grant the government. Now, I'm not disputing what you're saying. I'm just saying I think we should at least think about it carefully because governments have done our own government has done things for medical research that were obnoxious, thinking they were doing the right thing. And so,
all right.
Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you all. I'm going to cut us off. It is 5 minutes after the hour. Thank you all for attending and for sharing your perspectives today. I think we had a really robust discussion, so thank you for that. And hopefully we can do this again in the future. I will turn this off, but if you want to stay around to chat more, that's totally fine too. I'll leave the WebEx on for a bit. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Is it okay to ask a question for the remaining experts?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in the concept. I've been struggling with this a lot about a booster as an elderly physician in the ICU, with a January vaccine date. So I clearly understand the WHO position, and in fact, I agree with it. But at this juncture, an individual taking a shot isn't going to affect whether those in Afghanistan get an injection. And in fact, I understand that 200 million doses have already been purchased by the US government. So, I don't know exactly how to approach that.
Well, let me think about this aloud. I'm just thinking aloud about this. I actually didn't agree with the WHO about this. Let me tell you why. We don't tell people only get 1 dose of polio vaccine because there's not enough of it, right? We vaccinated people properly. And that took some time, right? And yes, Americans got vaccines. Americans got vaccines because it was American intervention. We got vaccines, all 3 doses of polio before other people. If in fact the Pfizer vaccine only works with 3 shots, it's not taking something away if everybody here gets 3 shots. We've already had 2, and you get 3, and you need 3. Many vaccines need several doses. That's not unusual. Hepatitis, DPT, you know that because the vaccine schedule. So it's not. It's that we don't know yet what the story is, and if it's not adequate, it's not adequate, right? And it has to be made adequate. If there's other ways to think about what's going on. It's about vaccine shortages. There's enough money in the world because we just saw billionaires lift off in space randomly, 2 of them for no reason whatsoever. And it wasn't even really space, it was just going on what's called the Vomit Comet in NASA. They could have spent that money on vaccines for poor countries. Absolutely. And the fact that they didn't is scandalous, frankly. That's the ethical nightmare we should be thinking about, not scared seniors taking a 3rd vaccine. I just think it's a misplaced anxiety for WHO. If the vaccine isn't effective in 2 doses, we need to figure that out and we need to address it. Right?
Well, I'm delighted to hear that opinion. I guess effectiveness is not a binary. It's not binary, and although I would really like to adopt it, I would argue that we have Delta because of India, and that perhaps the best approach we can take as a community to ensure we don't have some variant which is not which escapes all vaccine is to make sure that we don't have breeding grounds for that next variant.
Yeah, and that's
So
that's
I would posit for a whiteboard discussion that the best way to protect us globally is to give our vaccines to avert that possibility.
we should be with the COVAX program. We should be pumping money into countries all over the world so we don't have another India, especially India. China is doing a very good job of making sure that their population is constantly vaccinated, constantly tested. You see their very aggressive approach, and they've been wildly successful. That approach, we know what works to stop the COVID epidemic because we've seen China do it. And the more aggressive you are, the less disease you have, and the more your people will live. So it just has to do with how aggressive you're willing to be. we live in a country where we care so much about the economy that we keep feeling like there's this pull between it. So the problem. WHO has responsibility to think about the whole world, and so it's absolutely right for them to think about getting at least one dose to everybody would be their way of doing it. And there's a strong moral argument for doing that, for making sure that everybody has access to a vaccine. We've done it with polio. If you take, the financial incentive out, it was done with polio, it was done with smallpox. It was not done with malaria. Malaria was more complicated, but it was done for many, many countries for malaria. So it's usually just a matter of finances, a matter of money. And that would go a long way to dealing with it. After the money is there and the vaccines are made, you could change how the licensing works so that it could be made in other countries, so that it would be easier to be made in other countries. That would have helped a lot with Delta in India, for example. I mean, we don't want them to make a profit off of this. That seems obscene to us. That seems extraordinarily problematic. They've made a great deal of money, those companies, and that's okay. They spent a lot of money. They did it very fast. That's a good thing. They were very careful. Fair enough. But now I think the priority has to be to vaccinate the world against this disease. And I'm very pessimistic. I hope it's not too late. I hope that already in some place somewhere there could be a variant. Could be in Chicago. Some unvaccinated person cooking up a variant that's worse. There's no guarantee that there's nothing that protects us except one another. That's the difficult part of this. So
Yeah,
I'm actually I'm
I-
surprised that people were as antagonistic and wary of the vaccine as in this group as they were. I found that surprising, actually. So
Are we an open forum for questions and discussions? But my name's Alan Harris. I'm an ID doc and a hospital epidemiologist at Rush. This has been, I don't want to say enjoyable, but it's been very interesting and educational. And I think, and I am a transparent pro-vaccine person my whole life. I think they're the major cause of us living longer over the last 100 years, along with sanitation. But I would hope that some of our presenters might comment, and Dr. Zoloth did this very early on, and I thought she was spot on. When in internal medicine, I think the 4 tenets of our moral and ethical behavior by the American College of Physicians are: first, do no harm, or non-maleficence, which we can all agree on, I think. Beneficence, first, then do some good. And then is where it gets sticky, with autonomy and justice. And as one of the discussers pointed out, as physicians, we think about patient autonomy, and you give them the choices and go for it. But as Dr. Zoloth pointed out, that's when, in some of the other discussions, panelists, that stops when your behavior can impact other people. And that's where justice comes into play. And I think from a public health standpoint, the mandate is societal justice. Again, Dr. Zoloth, I think, used the phrase civilization. Yeah, your autonomy is, to use the phrase, trumped by societal justice. And the safety margin here of these vaccines is incredibly in favor of saving lives by giving them. Every time we hospitalize somebody right now, we're going to get to herd immunity, hopefully before we get a resistant variant to the vaccine that allows hospitalization and death. Because the way you get to herd immunity is exhaust the susceptibles or prevent it with vaccine. So
yeah.
Now we're exhausting susceptibles because of absence of vaccine mandates.
Yeah, unfortunately, with this disease, with Delta and Lambda, it didn't matter if you got the alpha version or the beta version. You still could get Delta. You can get reinfected very easily. I think that was in the chat about the reinfection rate being spectacularly high, and I think Gina pointed that out here, and that's really substantial. Yeah, it's unvaccinated have a 2-point 3-4 times higher risk of reinfection compared to vaccinated. So I think it's these are hard times. It's a bad disease. It's really a bad disease. And um I just hope people take it more seriously than we've seen here. And I think that there's a lot of reasons not to do things, but there's really a good reason to do it, which is to save lives, and that's got to be a priority. So I have to go. I do have to, because I'm a scholar of religion. I'll tell this. I have to say that does remind me of that very well that well travel joke about a man with the flood always waiting to be rescued, and he dies in the flood. He's overwhelmed by the waters, and he goes to God and he says, like, you promised to rescue me. I believed in you. Why didn't you rescue me? And he said, well, I sent a rowboat and I sent a helicopter, like, what else do you want? And I kind of feel like it's the same story. Like, we were rescued from this vaccine. There was a miracle. That miracle was we were rescued from this virus. We had a miraculous intervention with a vaccine. It worked at a very high rate of success. It should have worked if we had just gotten all vaccinated. If we had just gotten into the rowboat, we'd be okay. We'd be alive. And the fact that people were willing to risk that is, like I said, it's an American tragedy. And I hope we get through this, and I hope that my city comes back to life. But right now, it's really surprising the level of denial where people are participating in. So that's it. It's good to talk to everybody today, and I'm someone who likes to argue, obviously, and I consider arguing the highest form of compliment that people engage with one another in arguments. So take care.